Good evening, everyone. My name's Emma. I was the token Anglican on the MPhil last year, so forgive me for that. I had never meant to get into this area at all. I was supposed to be writing about insular manuscripts, and then the pandemic hit, and so I had to change tack, and it was suggested to me to try think of something a bit more contemporary where there would be more easily accessible resources. So I wandered into this problem of contemporary identity politics because I suppose I was feeling an increasing pressure to form some sort of intelligent and faith-formed response to the questions of the day. And I'm thinking about things like the Me Too movement, the marriage equality referendum, the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. And it wasn't an area I had really thought about in a very academic way before, but I felt like it would be important to address it. So in studying, I suppose, the theology of the human person, I think I came to some conclusions that might be helpful for us about how we can speak in the public conversation and in the public square about these very difficult issues. So I'm going to share those with you now. So what will happen in this presentation is just a little bit of a quick reflection on contemporary identity politics. Then we'll talk for a bit about what a person is. And then we'll talk about how the church can contribute to that public conversation. So what is this identity politics thing all about? In a caricature, you could say that it's a battle between, on one hand, sort of narrow-minded, right-wing, homophobic racists on one side, and then on the other side, radical, loony, lefty snowflakes who have mad notions about Greta Thunberg and pronouns and whatnot. So I found when you delve really into these issues, you see that that's really quite a straw man approach to the whole thing. What I found to be most interesting is this issue of essentialist thinking. And what I mean by this is that there's often an unacknowledged belief in something like essences as we find them in Greek philosophy. So the idea that there is a perfect standard for each of the human identities that you could appeal to in these debates that would allow you to be able to explain why someone else is wrong when they try to say something about their identity. And this crops up both on the right and the left, to kind of use very crude political designations here. So a person who has a more traditional or conservative outlook might want to appeal to conventional ideas about identity, like what a man should be or what a woman should be. And somebody on the left might want to appeal to some of the more kind of new cultural, political ideas of identity. So what a feminist should be, or so on. And in both cases, it's the lure of essentialism that is really what's going on here, because we like to know who belongs in our group and who are allowed to kick out of our groups when we don't like them anymore. So a conservative person, for example, might not like a man who likes to wear dresses or who is gay because they're not being manly in the right way. And someone who has more radical politics might want to exclude someone from a feminist group because they won't include transgender women in that group, and so they're not being feminist in the right way. I don't want to actually comment on either of those scenarios, but what I wanted to highlight is this strong desire to draw lines around a group identity and to have some sort of belief that there is some kind of essential connection between the members of a group. And the attraction of this essentialist approach to identity is that you have a very powerful sense of belonging to the group, and there's safety in feeling like you can predict how people will behave based on what identity they have. But the grave danger, obviously, of this approach is that actually there are thousands of aberrations to all of these different types of identities. And by that, I mean, there are so many people who don't fit into these groups very well, and they're cruelly persecuted by people on the left and on the right. And this is something that needs to be addressed. So this problem of essentialist thinking interested me greatly, and it led me fairly on to realize that a sort of sensible orthodox Christian teaching about identity was not going to result in a nice tidy list of essential identities that we can all hang our hats on. So if we're honest, the motivation behind essentialist thinking is much more to do with that desire to belong and to control who's allowed in and out, rather than having some sort of pure desire to understand the truth behind human identities. So I'll move on now to talk about what I discovered about the human person. A theology of identity that I ended up focusing on was the Personalist Theology of Archbishop Rowan Williams, who's a former Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury. And I would direct you all to a very readable book of his, Being Human, Bodies, Minds and Persons. And this work simplifies and expands on the Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky's Christological vision of the person. So Lossky begins with the persons of the Trinity, since Christ has a human and a divine nature, but is one person. It makes it impossible to conclude that personhood, or hypostasis to use the technical term, is equivalent to a human nature. Personhood is something different. And a human person can't be separated out from their human nature, but they can't be reduced down to it either. You are more than your human nature. Even though that you-ness is contained by your human nature. Your you-ness, your person, your hypostasis, says Lossky, is this mysterious thing that makes you you, but it cannot be boiled down or reduced to a set of identity characteristics. And Williams expands on this helpfully. So, for example, I could say that I'm a woman, I'm white, I'm from County Carlow, I have a very loud laugh, and I got 10 stitches in my knee when I was 10. But this list of characteristics and experiences that I've had will still not sum up my person, even if that list was a complete one of every experience I've ever had and every characteristic. Because Williams says that I am also a place where a complex network of relationships actually meet together. And I'm an environment for other persons where they can grow and flourish, and God forbid, where they can be damaged and destroyed as well. And I'm also able to reflect on all these things about my person. And I hope you're reflecting on these ideas too. And that means your person and my person are changing right now because of this act of reflection that we're doing now. So this is a negative theological approach, something that's been mentioned already. And we don't mean by that a bad one, but we mean that we're establishing what we cannot know, and we're stripping back all the things maybe we thought that we did know. And that was one of the greatest lessons of the MPhil program, that you regulate your theology by reminding yourself of what you can't know. Otherwise, we become comfortable with idols of God and of what it is to be human. So some highlights then of what this theology of the person means. Williams says that it's possible to build up some sort of positive content about what a person is, and that's done by engaging with Christ in the church as he reveals himself there. And of course, Rowan Williams likes to remind us that Christ always throws up as many questions as he answers, so that's not necessarily an easy answer. But through the church's traditions and its liturgy, its theology, the people who make up the church, we can come to an understanding of who and what our person is. Williams also highlights, particularly in his study of Augustine's Confessions, the prior relationship of the person to God. So that relationship exists before you are related to anyone or anything else. And that loving grasp is the most important piece of positive theology that we can speak about or know about what a person is, that loving grasp of God. He also says interesting things about our responsible identity as persons. He writes really beautifully in Being Human about how we each love in a particular mode or key, like musical key, because of that fundamental particularity, that irreducibility at the core of our personhood, that total uniqueness of the person. So as such, we have responsibility then to offer that particular gift of love that we have to the world, because nobody else can do that. Finally, two thoughts in this section on relationships. So Williams again writes very well about the victim-oppressor relationship that's often thrown around in these public conversations about identity today. And he speaks about our need to transform our thinking around that. We need to move more in the direction of thinking about repentance that's meaningful, and then a shift away from competition and power and struggle, towards what he calls this economy of gift, or economy of love. And that brings me to a second point, which is that for Williams, diversity doesn't have to lead to conflict and competition. What all this talk about irreducibility and this kind of infinite complexity of any one person leads us to is the idea that when you bring all this diversity together and you smash it all against one another, we quickly realize that far from being able to gather ourselves under little umbrella identity labels, we realize that we're so infinitely diverse. The only thing we actually have in common is that we are irreducible persons. And at this point, I throw in a caveat, because I think that it is important that groups gather under identity labels for the purpose of fighting for rights in political and civil life. However, theologically speaking, it's not possible to categorize people in the way that we do in politics. And my argument is that while political groups absolutely should play this role in society and bring the concerns of groups who are united by some characteristic, they should bring that to the public forum. The sort of theological job that we have to do is to regulate that conversation, not stop it or shut it down or control it, but regulate it with this negative theology that reminds everybody that the only thing a group of human persons really have in common is their humanity. And that regulation is important because it safeguards against that essentialist piece I was talking about at the start. This tyranny of an identity label where you can control who's allowed in and who gets kicked out. So by sort of dismantling, I suppose, those cheap essentialist identities, we can save people from great pain. So this is the last slide, and I come now to the set of conversational principles and skills that I think some of this theology can inform and give us some ideas about how we could best participate in public conversations about all these difficult issues of identity that can be very painful and tricky and full of conflict. So a first principle is that everyone has to be admitted to the conversation, and Christians are going to have to grow quite a thick skin about this. There are lots of debates about cancel culture and whether people with disturbing views should be shut out and not given public platforms. So I can't advise, I suppose, about how every type of institution should act, but I think in a civil society, in the public square, it has to be open to all, because a Christian understanding of this prior relationship that we have with God imbues even the most kind of barbarous enemy with dignity. And the call to love one's enemy surely at least stretches to giving them leave to speak to us for a little while. The second thing then is remaining open to the challenge of Christ, the stranger, and Christ in the stranger. It's important for the church to remember that it speaks with Christ, not for him, in these public conversations. And Williams is very taken by this idea that when Christ appears after the resurrection, he is strange to everybody, and that the Easter story is not a tidy ending. So whatever we think we know about what God thinks about identities, we should hold that a little bit lightly, because we should remember there were periods in our history where the church believed that if a man had the identity of husband, then it wasn't possible for him to be raping his wife. Or if a person had a Black identity, then you could justify enslaving them. So what we know about identity has to be held a little bit lightly when we reflect on the mistakes that were made. And then we talk about the skills of silence. So building on what I've just said, obviously listening to other people and learning from them is important. And in addition to that, I think that the church also has to keep watch and discern very carefully who isn't being kept quiet. I don't want to start an Oprah Winfrey meme here again about being silenced, but as we have discussed, the essentialist approach to identity means that people are being shoved out into the cold by all sorts of groups. So I'm not just making a lefty appeal here that the church has to stand up for whoever it's trendy to stand up for on Twitter at the moment. We have to really look carefully and discern who are the groups who are not being heard from. And the last piece on silence is just to say that silence of politeness and silence of fear have to be rejected as well, because standing by while others suffer and being afraid to speak up is as damaging as actually saying the hurtful things. Tarrying with difference then is the next point. It's another principle of William's approach. So he's confident that a sort of rich, deep, meaningful engagement with difference is a really good learning experience, and it points to our common humanity. But he's not naive about the fact that those conversations often are very difficult and they often break down and don't go well. So one of our conversational skills has to be being willing to engage in really unpleasant conversations with patients and for very long periods of time. Williams also loves to write about the body and our embodied encounters with difference. To sum that up quickly, I suppose I would say that working alongside people on practical projects in kind of real life is a really meaningful way to have positive relationships across our difference. So when the church is going to the public square, it should maybe pick up its shovel on the way. And then the very last thing to say here is that our responsible identity means that we have a responsibility to the public conversation. The withdrawal of the church or of any voice in society impoverishes us all. We have to try and see the potential that there is to learn and to grow, because even the most wrong person, the most difficult person in their wrongness, they have a special way of showing your rightness that only they can show by being so wrong in the way that they are wrong, if that makes sense at all. So there's a great hope and possibility, I suppose, in clashing in the public square with difference. So I hope that's been of interest to you all, and thanks so much for listening.